With this example of JavaScript, I'd like to talk about accessing elements on the web page from the JavaScript code. So I'm just going to explore the HTML file first and take a look at the elements on the HTML page, and then we'll look at the JavaScript to see how we can access the elements on the HTML page or within the web page document. So the first thing you'll notice, I have some basic elements, nothing really new. The first one I want to look at is the first paragraph tag that we see here. This first paragraph tag, the only real difference that you might notice would be the ID indicator here. Notice the ID attribute is being assigned a name, and the name is a string, and you'll notice I use the apostrophes. You could use the double quotes. You just have to be consistent. The next thing you might notice, it's a little bit different, is I just put some static text right on the page here with this first name colon, and there is a space there right after the colon. And following that, I have an input element, and the input element is very simple. There's no closing tag, you'll notice, on this input element. But it also has an ID attribute, and again I gave it a unique name. In this case it's input01. A couple of breaks just to move the next item down the page a bit, and that's the last name. And it also has an input element following it, and of course it's got an ID attribute, and I changed the name here to input02 so that we can distinguish between these two input elements. A few more breaks, and then a text area. And again, of course, I added an ID attribute to the text area, and I gave it the name text01. And of course, I used the apostrophes. You'll also notice that I specified how many columns I wanted it to be. This is the width of the text area, and I specified 5 rows. Again, these are both attributes of a text area. And again, I'm assigning a value to that attribute, and the values for your attributes need to be strings. I used apostrophes. You could use the quotes. And then the closing tag for the text area, of course, is required. Down near the bottom here, you see I have a button. I didn't need an ID attribute for my button because I wasn't going to try to access this button from my JavaScript. But I did want the click handler for my button so that when the user clicked on the button, it would call the correct function in my JavaScript. And so this is simply another attribute, the onClick attribute. And again, I assign a string to that attribute. And in this case, of course, it's main with the parentheses. And again, that has to be in the apostrophes or quotes. This is just the label that you see on your button, of course, and then the closing tag for your button. Nothing too new here. Finally, at the bottom, I have my script tag that refers to the external script file. The external script file, in this case, I just named it script.js. Again, that's just another attribute element of the script tag, the src attribute, and I'm assigning the script file name to that source attribute. Notice in this case I did use the quotation marks rather than apostrophes. Either one, doesn't matter. Now this does refer to a file called script.js, so you need to make sure in your file listing that you named your script file the same thing that you used in the source tag here. So let's take a look at that script file. So I'll click up here in the file listing, my script file. So here's my script file. A simple little comment up here at the top, nothing too mysterious, but just a little comment up at the top. And finally then we get into the function itself. So here's main. Again, that's the name of the function that I'm calling from my HTML. And I have 4 lines of code here, and these 4 lines of code simply declare 4 variables and assign values to those 4 variables. So let's just take a look at this first variable. Again, these names are arbitrary. You can name them whatever you want. They should name something that reminds you what they're being used for. The first variable we see here is called para_element, and we're assigning the value to that variable by going to the web document. You'll notice the word document here. That's a predefined variable that's available to JavaScript in a web application. So we can access the document element from our web page, and that document element has a function called getElementById, and you have to get the case correct. If you're using Thimble, it pops up some pick lists, and you can just pick that function name from the pick list so you don't have to type it. But if you ever do find yourself typing it out yourself, be very careful getting the case right with the capital E, the capital B, the capital I. So that getElement function is essentially asking the document element, which item from the web page do you want to get? And in this case, you'll notice I simply put the ID name that I used on my web page for that paragraph. So the ID in my HTML was called para1, Para01. And again, notice it's a string, so it's in the quotes there, or it's actually apostrophes in this case. And so I did that for the other 3 variables defined. And the second one, I wanted to get the input box, the first input box after first name. The third one, I used input 02 for the last name. And then to get the text area element, I named that one text01. And so getElementById goes out and grabs the individual HTML objects from the page, the paragraph, the 2 input boxes, and the text area, and stores them in these variables. So now my JavaScript program has access to those 4 objects from the web page. So this next example you see here with paraElement is simply accessing that paragraph object from the web page and accessing its inner HTML property. You notice the dot notation here says go to the paragraph object, the paragraph element object that I stored in my variable, and access its inner HTML and assign, that's the assignment, assign this string, this is just a random string, testing 1, 2, 3, and assign it to the inner HTML. Now when we actually click the button and run this code, you should see the contents of that paragraph change to this string. So before we do that, let's read on down the rest of this. The next line you see is another variable declaration where I declare a variable called first name, and the value I assign to that is the value taken from input box 1. The object input box 1 has been assigned to my in01 variable. I access its value property. Notice for input boxes I use the value property rather than the inner HTML property. So I use the value property of that input box object. It gives me whatever is in that input box and assigns it then to this first name variable. I do the same thing with the last name variable. I go to in02, that's the variable name that I use to store the second input box. I access its value property, which gets whatever text is inside that second input box, and we store that in the last name variable. So now we have those 2 variables. And finally, I'd like to put those values, the first name and last name values, I'd like to put them into my text area. So you'll notice the very last line essentially takes the string hello, notice the quotes, adds to that or concatenates. We call string addition here, we call that concatenation. It's like gluing strings together. We take the hello, we glue onto the end of that the first name variable, which takes the value out of that variable and glues it onto hello. Then we glue on a space, just that's the space inside those apostrophes. You have to hit the space bar. And finally then we glue on the last name value. And we get this long string that says hello and whatever the first name is and a space and whatever the last name is. And we take that whole string and we assign it to the value property of the text area object, which has been stored in this variable called text01. So the value property then is how you access the text in a text area object. So when we run this in, it should put the first and last name into that text box. Now before we actually try this out, I'd like to just take a peek at the style sheet. So the style.css page is quite simple. We see that it just does a little bit with the font. So the body is set to sans serif, and the button size, font size, is 20 pixels, and then the last three elements, the paragraph is 18 pixels, and the input boxes, notice it just says an input element here. Any input element is going to have a font size of 18 pixels. And then any text area element will also have a font size of 18 pixels. So this is just a little sample of how you can style elements on your page. So now let's go over to the preview window here and see what's going to happen if I type in a first name here. So I'll type in Bob in first name box, and I'll type in Smith in the last name box. And then if I click my button, of course, it should change the paragraph element up here to testing 1, 2, 3, and it should put Bob Smith into the text area. So I'll click the button, and there it is. Hello, Bob Smith. And of course, the testing 1, 2, 3 of my paragraph has been changed up at the top. So I'll click back on my HTML page. There is the entire HTML. Click on the script file, and there is the entire JavaScript for this. Give that a try.